Hi, I'm Maisen. I'll be a Prime Minister. He, him is fine, and I prefer POIs verbally. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We can't fight fire with fire, unlike what side opposition wants us to believe. We from side government believe that pride parades are just another move, or just another thing, another activity that decreases the perception from the conservative people towards the LGBTQ community. We believe that in conservative countries, the first step is to getting to accept the LGBTQ community, is to understand and find a middle ground which will allow the conservative people and the people from the LGBTQ community to live together harmoniously. The burden we are carrying from side proposition is that we will prove to you by the end of this day on why pride parades aren't effective in alleviating the harm done towards the LGBTQ people. So, few characterizations before I go into my constructive arguments. First of all, conservatives. So let's say a typical conservative country, let's say, for example, Singapore and Malaysia, right? So to paint a better picture, conservative countries or conservatives in general are people that believe in traditional values. For example, in the context of this debate, such as like the relationship status between men and women and as a standard couple, right? And most of the time, these people don't not likely to accept all the like values that like just came into society. And the values like ancient values are seen as extremely important, and anything outside of those values are considered immoral. So why and so they need time and slow phasing in and slow introduction to all these like to all these different kinds of people. And most of the time, most of them do not understand because they weren't introduced to it from the first place. They are suddenly being introduced, and through pride parades, it's such a big culture shock, as we're going to talk about later. POIs verbally, please. So why aren't they supporting it? A few reasons is, first of all, it goes against the values that they have taught, and secondly, it also is a discrimination towards their family. No, thank you, towards their family and against themselves. So what are the comparatives we are giving from our side? So first of all, we plan to do this through education. Another method is through like and communication with strong and influential people in the country to ensure like a more diplomatic and effective way to introducing these LGBTQ people and getting people to accept these LGBTQ people. No, thank you. And most importantly, we aren't saying that people from LGBTQ communities should live in fear in these countries. We just think the pride parades aren't effective, especially in these conservative countries. And on a bigger note, we aren't talking about our typical liberal countries like America and Canada. We're talking about conservative countries in where people have a fixed mindset, and this needs to change. So, LGBTQ community, they're just starting to gain validation and recognition. No, thank you. And pride parades are a harm to these movements, unlike what side opposition wants. They're fighting for acceptance, and most of these LGBTQ people in the countries aren't coming out because of the main problem, which is fear, and also fear of suffering and discrimination towards their families and themselves. So pride parades are too outspoken and are very blatantly against the conservative values. Pride parades are too much of a big demonstration, and in these conservative countries, which lead to my first argument, which is we need to maintain, we ensure the importance of maintaining the middle ground and for acceptance, right? So what are people from the LGBTQ community striving for? They're striving for acceptance. Pride parades do not help this because they are huge and blatant, and they, even though they aren't, they look blatantly against whatever the conservative countries are believing. And so like with that, it of course causes riots and chaos. LGBTQ people just want to be accepted as who they are. They don't really care or want to know if people aren't fully supporting it. They just want to feel accepted and not discriminated or cast away. So why are side opposition bad in this world? So first of all, as we have said, pride parades are too extreme and too fast-paced, which can cause culture shocks to these conservatives in these conservative countries, thus leading them to not accept this. Secondly, people from conservative countries don't want to accept because of the reasons that I've stated earlier, but they would also feel attacked and threatened, which isn't what we want. LGBTQ people, and especially pride parades, aren't an effective way to introduce or gain acceptance in these conservative countries, because they wouldn't know about it or they don't really understand it in the first place. So here's why we're better. Our plan of introducing it slowly is much more foolproof. It's a much more slowly but surely method. We plan to phase it in slowly. No, thank you. We plan to phase it in slowly so that people can get to understand, and people from conservative countries can get to understand and accept it and use the ways that we have stated before, like through education and so forth. Now, moving on to my second argument, which is we ensure the safety of the citizens, especially from the LGBTQ community, right? So when people participate in these huge pride parades, I have to iterate that pride parades are huge, right? They are beyond comparison towards any other parades. So this leads to lashing out all those adrenaline rushes when many people of the same and all the pain from the years that they have been living in fear and being kept in their homes, they are living all the pain that is going to be let out in one go from a huge group of people, which will indefinitely lead to riots and backlash. So two reasons why they are bad. I'll divide it into two parts. First of all, the LGBTQ plus individual. There's lots of fancy decorations and stuff go into a huge pride parade. Many people, which creates anger and frustration, as we have stated before. Secondly, conservatives in this country, although they're not against it, seeing this action of these pride parades, they will feel attacked and threatened, thus creating a much worse perception towards this LGBTQ community, thus slowing down the progress of the acceptance of them in their communities. So here's why we are better than side opposition. First of all, we ensure both the safety of citizens. Here's why. It causes a lot, these parades cause a lot of anger and frustration. We do not have this from our side. These riots and protests will most definitely happen from these extremist parties and are inevitable in opposition's world. They cannot say this will not happen. And when this happens, in turn, this causes harms and accidents. Thirdly, we ensure the safety with the slow phasing in of LGBTQ communities in these conservative countries, thus creating a much more effective way in phasing in. So you have to understand that our way is a much more effective one, and we from side of proposition are very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's welcome Leader of Opposition to open the case and here.
Hi, am I both visible and audible?
Yeah, clear.
Okay, verbal PIC and pronouns. Thanks. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the most excruciating torture of humanity is not done to the physical body. It is the suffocation of identity and who you perceive yourself to be. We think that pride parades unshackles the constraints of the LGBTQ community to break through the glass ceiling. We are proud to oppose. I think our burden in this debate is just that we simply need to prove that it is the incentive of the LGBTQ community to hold pride parades. And our stance is simple. We would encourage pride parades that are strategic to maximize awareness. The framing is twofold. First, LGBT communities, I think generally they are local communities, and the incentives are twofold. First, they want better protection of LGBTQ community rights, and secondly, they want to include all members of the LGBTQ community in order for it to be a holistic and inclusive community as a whole. The pride parades are probably peaceful parades that celebrate the LGBTQ plus community across many countries. It happens probably simultaneously. The second piece of characterization is the conservative country. We'd like to add two things to the prop characterization. One, it probably has an authoritarian government and rigid social structures. That is to say, education probably doesn't work on its side because the authoritarian government has absolutely no incentive to do so. However, secondly, there's probably enough room for an LGBTQ community in the first place, because if it didn't, we wouldn't have the debate. So first, I want to talk about rebuttals, which is the first thing talking about the counter model. I don't think government has to say like we're going to improve education without actually proving what the incentive of the government to support education for LGBT community is, because we think that generally in the authoritarian government that's traditionally conservative, as they do characterize, is probably religious, there's absolutely no incentive to care about the LGBTQ identity, and therefore I don't think they have the fiat to actually prove education. But secondly, I want to talk about the premise to the argument one, which is that LGBTQ only communities only wants to feel accepted. The key word is that feel. No, they don't want to feel accepted. They actually want it to be accepted respected and protected. And this starts with more support and more awareness that our side stands for. The rest of the rebuttals are integrated. We provide two arguments. One, the LGBTQ community probably supports pride parades, and by discouraging pride parades, you disconnect the vulnerable group from other communities. And secondly, we actually advocate for the inclusion of the LGBTQ+ community. So the first argument, we have three layers. One, we think that generally by discouraging LGBTQ pride parades, it damages international support because international actors prioritize representation and celebration over anything. This is true because A, you're more likely going to get presence globally. It's generally good for any movement who wants representation for a certain group of people. B, is seen as more charitable and it's given generally positive when supporting vulnerable actors, i.e. people who are repressed inside conservative countries. And C, it brings more emphasis on the problems into other nations. Developing nations are typically doing better and in a good way to garner more funding if they have a more sympathetic story. This means that under the current status quo, international movements with one, more funding, and two, more public appeal would more likely going to sponsor you if you're able to express yourself. This is absolutely necessary because movements are weak inside conservative countries due to a lack of public appeal. But secondly, it's generally easier to access aid if you have more connections with international movements. Pride parades are the only way to access this because it's the easiest way to express yourself, and it's also sensationalized and easy to get onto media in other countries like the US. Therefore, organizing and using pride parades are a method of celebration which is more likely going to garner attention internationally, therefore gaining far more funding and sympathy for from developing states. The layer two is that even if violence happens, this engage on the best case during pride parades, more support will come. This is firstly true because we attract more international attention for the concern and issue at hand. It evolves from an identity issue into a humanitarian issue. But secondly, we have a far more cohesive community because there's a common enemy that is the government. We incentivize people to stick together in these communities. This is far better because for the safety, people more likely sticking together are far better. The third layer of analysis is that the prop comparative does not solve this. The narrative within the LGBTQ community now becomes of one of repression, like you're not proud of yourself and you should discourage being proud of yourself. This does not build inclusion as there's not individuals within the community who want to come out while some don't. So secondly, to splinter the part of the movement internally, you're preventing cooperation and assistance. Pride parades can start and impacts trickles down to everything else. That means that you no longer have people coming out even in tight communities. It shutdowns any chance for legislative change in the government, and popular conservative narrative stays the same on proposition. The second argument we have is that we have include those in the LGBTQ+ community. We have two layers. First, pride communities allows individuals to come out of the closet. The issue with the status quo is that there are too many LGBTQ people in conservative nations that cannot come out of the closet. They're afraid of their own community, the ones closest to them, looking down to them. Encouraging a pride parade means that we take a stand that there is a community for those who have been suppressed their identity for far too long to belong in. But secondly, we can show people where can find support, right? Like having a pride parade probably means that we can there's support and people who go to and people know where to find that help. Discouraging the pride parades sends a message to the people that one, they should suppress their own identities, but secondly, they should not have any freedom to express their wants. This impact is massive because people no longer need to feel insecure. We posit that far more individuals can be alleviated from their excruciating plane of twisting your personality to conform to societal norms. This is a principal benefit, firstly, because of a right to identity. This is what defines you and makes you human. If others get to dictate who you are simply unable to find happiness, simply unable to find your good life. That is not a life we stand for. But the second benefit is that simply we have less people going into depression, people who cannot stand the fact that people have to look down on them for their true self. So therefore, I think this argument simply is already a path to victory. Before I move on, are there any POIs? Okay, moving on then. The second layer is that people that are already part of the movement stay consistent to their movement, because the fact that many people in the LGBTQ movement believe that they should speak out against the government, and there are some people that might believe that they don't advocate for rights. But when you principally are inconsistent with your movement, that is to say, when you're not willing to stand up against the government and stand up to a common enemy, people believe that they're alienated, because the fact that people cannot connect to this community because communities are separate. They're separate from locally, they're separated from like in terms of connection, and they're separated in terms of like the government has an active incentive to separate these movements. When we are unable to have a common movement at the same time starting together like a pride parade, people are unable to connect. People are far more weaker because governments can divide and conquer, because people don't feel that they actually have a community and they are actually have enough people to stand up against authorities, against the government. So what does this mean, right? Firstly, we proved that we have far more accessibility in terms of aid. We get people to have far more accessibilities into international communities. In the worst case, where violence does occur, that we think that it's still better because there's more likely going to be foreign intervention, like the UN having Security Council meetings talking about the humanitarian aid in these developing countries. But secondly, we proved that there's a fundamental principle right for people to come out of the closet, and we include them on our side of the house. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for that fine speech. Let's welcome Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, give me a moment to sort out my papers. Right, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Great. Great. She, her, POIs in the chat, please. I won't take them verbally. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition is fighting for short-term liberation and a sense of unity and freedom. But in reality, they do not realize that these kind of countries have deep-set values that cannot be changed overnight. That the freedom and the acceptance and the support that they're trying to garner will not be accepted in those kind of countries. Those types of the situations, the unique situations that pride parades cannot solve. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose 2 things I'm going to talk about in this speech. First of all, on the importance of the middle ground. Second of all, on order and peace in society. So first of all, on the middle ground itself, they told us that our comparative do not work, that the education that doesn't work because the authoritarian countries will not solve it in the first place. We believe that at the end of the day, governments will accept this for a couple of reasons. First of all, because some people who are part of the LGBT community have capabilities to make the country better. In most of the conservative countries, they are most likely not as successful as those type of liberal countries. Therefore, those people in the LGBT community are needed in order to make the economy or something better, right? But second of all, because public image is really important to these kind of conservative countries. So even though it might go against some of our values in the first place, they would eventually accept that with the education, and the future generation would accept it as well. So we don't see why this is a problem in the first place. But on their side of the house, when they create these kind of pride parades, when this is a large movement that has never occurred in these kind of societies before, that are the situations where these kind of conservative government cannot accept. We also told you that acceptance is the end goal of these kind of LGBTQ individuals. We believe that pride parades are counterproductive to maintain a good relationship between the LGBT community and the conservative people, because it's such a big change and people cannot accept it overnight, right? They also talk, so it's under the second theme on order and peace in society. We have already told you, they told you that pride parades are most of the time peaceful, and it's just a way for them to express their freedom and liberation and to avoid election. I don't really see that this is the case. On Prime Minister, we have already told you why most of these people, they have lived in long hate towards these kind of conservative people, and they have lived in fear and things. When you create big kinds of movements such as pride parades, when you allow all of them to get into one big situation, when they have big flashy signs with that call for people to accept that, we believe that this is when anger and frustration erupts, where they're united not to fight the implicit discrimination that always goes in their community, but more they want to fight against the people who have caused them this suffering. We believe that this is counterproductive in a lot of ways that would hurt the movement itself, and at the end of the day, drive people into even more hiding. So we don't really understand why that is on their case, right? They also talked about how authoritarian countries will not support this in the first place, but then their contradiction in their case, they said that other countries will come to give international support and help, right? We believe that, first of all, we believe that these kind of authoritarian countries, if they want to talk about these kind of situations, would also block these kind of international relations because it doesn't align with their own values in the first place anyways, right? And because this pride parade, they increase the discrimination towards these kind of things, these kind of situations, so they are less likely to accept the LGBT movement and countries who accept these kind of movements, right? But second of all, we believe that the UN, the UN they want to talk about, will not interfere in these kind of situations because of the religious reasons they are using to back up their discrimination towards these kind of countries. So at the end of the day, the countries that will not give humanitarian aid, and even if they given it in their best case, those countries will not accept it anyways because it doesn't align with our values. What did we tell? No, thank you. PR is in the chat. What did we tell you from the start? We have already told you that we have to go slow in these kind of cases. We cannot fight fire with fire because when we don't change the implicit biases that through these kind of education and these kind of diplomatic relationships with higher ups, we don't believe that this is the way to go. All right, so on to the last argument, but before that, yes. I'll take the
Your only rebuttal to our first entire argument was that the UN cannot exist. Note that other charities like NGOs and charities like that actually donate within these countries will get a lot more power if pride parades are popular.
But at the end of the day, we believe that these kind of countries which are conservative, they wouldn't even accept these kind of help in the first place. Because when you create this kind of pride parades, it just increases the discrimination and they are less likely to choose this kind of aid. Firstly, because of religious reasons that we already told you about, and secondly, because we told you that it doesn't. You just increase the discrimination with pride parades, so it just increases anger and increases fear. So, onto the third argument on backlash towards the LGBT community. The premise of this argument is that in conservative countries, there are a lot of extremists that exist, especially in the higher ups who rule the country and are of higher class, right? We believe that in these kind of cases, the justice system in these kind of conservative countries will cater to them even more because of their influence and their pull in society. We have already said numerous times that pride parades are extremely loud. It's meant to be a big demonstration to show their own power. However, it doesn't work in these kind of cases because it just would result in chaos and riots, fights because of the implicit injustice done to them in the first place, right? So why is opposition bad in these kind of cases? First, because we believe that pride parades harm the LGBT movement, which means that most people have to go into hiding because of the backlash that people will do towards them, and even more fear and uncertainty about their own identity and own community will occur. Secondly, because it creates a bad first assumption towards the movement itself. In opposition's best case, where conservatives aren't actively against these kind of LGBT movements, it still means that when they see the kind of chaos and the kind of loud and violence that happens in these kind of pride parades, it will just creates a bad pre-assumption towards them and think that their sexuality is something that is part of this. All right, third of all, and we think that a lot of people that participate in these kind of pride parades, because of the justice system in these kind of countries, they will be captured and publicly humiliated, which means that their own identity, they will be even more uncertain about their own identity and will live in hiding and fear forever. So why are we better on ourselves, right? Firstly, because we think that we are implementing a slow introduction of these kind of values. We believe that at the end of the day, when we use these kind of values, when people actually understand more about the situation, where we're teaching the future generation about these kind of biological characteristics that people cannot control, we believe that without these kind of loud demonstrations such as pride parades that disrupts the flow of everything, we think that at the end of the day, we are able to change these conservative minds and change the movement in these kind of situations, right? Opposition has never actually offered us a comparative on why they are better and why pride parades can actually solve these kind of problems. All they are telling us that is uniting others, but at the end of the day, does not help them because the country is against it. For all this reason, it's very important.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Yeah, can I just confirm that I'm audible?
Yeah, clear.
Got it, thank you. Just let me get my timer ready, sorry. All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll highlight 4 things in my speech. 1, on the model and the counterfactual presented by side proposition, why we don't think that this is effective in any way, and we don't think that it actually reflects the impacts that they want to happen. Second of all, on the issue of acceptance, why they don't do it, why we do it a lot better. Third, on the international support. Why is this likely and why is this critical and why do we basically win based on this point? Lastly, on the issue of safety, which is the entirety of the impacts that proposition hinges on, why we're able to still prevent this somewhat. And even if it does happen, why does this SAB actually strengthen the movement altogether and build a lot more actual fires so that the movement can be able to utilize inside governments in the first place? First, let's just talk about their counterfactual because they make a huge assumption here. They essentially tell us that, we're going to be able to somehow fund education for everyone and reform the entire education system so that we'll be able to teach people to accept the individuals of the LGBTQ community better. Look, there's so many problems with this model. I'll just point out 3 in my speech. One, I think my partner has already made it sufficiently clear that it is very unlikely for a government to, in any way, shape, or form, subsidize something like this. Notes that in this debate, we're talking about individuals of this community. We're talking about individuals of the LGBTQ community, not the government inherently. Therefore, on your side, when you already frame these states as basically being majority conservative, there's no way a government will actually want to subsidize your education system if it somehow infuriates your voters, which your side actually framed. Second of all, they tell you in their deputy that, well, these governments care about their public image. They want to be able to be seen as charitable. Look, under these states that are already mostly authoritative, under these states that are already having conservative values, we don't think public image is their main concern anyways. We don't think this is sufficient enough incentive for them to subsidize something that their voters probably would disagree with at first. Third, even assuming their absolute best case that this somehow passes within government, note this is unlikely going to work in any way. Why is this? One, they actively support a slow narrative. That is to say that this narrative isn't something that is going to mean that you're actually going to get people educated. You're going to have them go through a slow burn to get people slowly be able to accept them in a long run. Note that due to this slowness, you're going to have contradicting values from religion, from your parents, from your echo chambers that already take this impact out. Second of all, notes that it is because of the fact that oftentimes people want their education system to be mostly secular, i.e. something that they want to be able to learn in the first place. Not everyone is going to be able to listen to these classes in the first place. Therefore, on your side, you actively build more resentment because in the long run, because you spend so much time every single day learning about these things, you're not going to actually like it. Therefore, on your side, you actually still build resentment with your slow burn, even when it's not intended. Rather, on our side, note that pride parades are things that happen basically once or twice a year. Even if all the impacts with violence happen, it only happens once or twice a year. On your side, it happens yearly with the entire schooling system. Therefore, we think based on this, their model simply does not stand. Second thing, on acceptance, which is no thank you, one of the incentives that they want to highlight the most. We already told you clearly that these individuals are the main incentive for all these individuals inside conservative countries is not to somehow feel accepted. They have to be accepted in the first place. But the important nuance here is that A, this means in the long term, you're actually going to be respected inside areas. Second of all, this also means that you're less likely persecuted by the government. We think these are 2 things that are incredibly important for individuals living in conservative countries. What then did they tell you? They first tell you that, well, under the world where pride parades exist, essentially people will hate you more because of the fact that you're being disruptive to everyone and somehow no one's going to be able to accept their message. 2 responses to this entire argument. First of all, their entire case hinges on essentially that, well, everyone's not able to comprehend the message altogether. I don't see why this is the case with pride parades, especially when pride parades are uniquely there to celebrate certain things. They're able to be there to educate individuals on what things that individuals or the LGBTQ community are prideful for, and they're there so that they'll be able to have fun for a lot of other individuals. I don't see why this means that individuals are going to build active resentment. Second layer of response then, even if this builds active resentment, why is our side still significantly better? A, it is because of the fact that you actually get some form of discourse in the first place, i.e. you get on media attention, you have some way of accessing popular narratives in the first place. This means you're actually going to get active discussion. Note that a lot of individuals discriminate against these communities because of the fact that they don't have the full context as to how they exist or what type of person they are, because it is basically different from their traditional beliefs. On our side, once you're able to introduce a counter narrative in the first place, i.e. through pride parades, note that on our side, you're actually able to get some form of discourse, get people actually being able to research about these issues. For the young generation that we're talking about, these are the people that are more likely going to commit to all these actions based on pride parades. So on our side, you're actually able to gain more acceptance simply due to the fact that you're actually able to get some form of discourse. The comparative on their side, essentially that one, the slow burn model basically doesn't work because it contradicts all the values on their side. Second of all, note that it is because of the fact that you are basically discouraging individuals from ever trying to go out and actually speak out about their issues. No one on their side, i.e. anyone from the LGBTQ community on their side, is ever going to try to come out or in any way, shape, or form. My partner has already made it sufficiently clear in his speech when this basically already contradicts your own identity. It contradicts your own ability to live as an individual freely. Therefore, we think based on this issue, because the core incentive of an individual is to allow for themselves to be represented and feel actually be accepted in the first place, I think our side does this better because A, in the long run, you get more discourse. Second of all, on our side, you're actually allowing individuals to come out, you're actually allowing individuals to be themselves. Therefore, we win on this issue of acceptance. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Given that in pride parades it causes so much chaos, how is the government going to erect?
I understand your POI. I'll respond to this more extensively in my fourth class. But before I move on to that one, I'll just mainly talk about our issue about international help. DPM says that we're not able to access any form of international help because the governments are going to bar the sort of aid coming in. One, that is not our point. Our point is essentially that we're going to support these individuals, part of these communities, by providing with financial backing, by providing them more resources to help with their pride parades, by providing them a message and a platform so they'll be able to explain their views. We're not giving things to the conservative government. We're giving things to the individuals that are part of this community. Second of all, notice that it is a lot less likely on your side you're able to get any of this because on your side, you actively don't allow them to speak out with pride parades. On your side, people have to remain in secret and have to rely on themselves. Rather, on our side, we're able to leverage the huge public appeal of the LGBTQ movement in the international stage, so we'll be able to benefit these individuals more. Based on incentive that we are allowing these individuals to come out more easily, on our side, we give them the resources to do so. Therefore, we allow for better acceptance on our side. Lastly, on the issue of safety, note that on their side, they make this huge assertion, which is that because the fact that you have this pent-up hatred is suddenly going to turn the entire parade violence. Two responses. One, we just don't think this is true. To give an analogous example, take, for example, the pride parade after Stonewall riot. Essentially in the 1970s, in a red state in the US, where homophobia was very, very prevalent, they raided a huge gay bar and basically persecuted a bunch of its individuals, and pride parade after that is still peaceful because individuals know to control themselves. It is not in their incentive to frame themselves as murderers. It's definitely not in their incentive to go for chaos in the first place. Second response, even if we assume this is true, we think that this only builds more international support. We're the side that is actually going to get more discourse in the media. We actually get some form of representation. They do not in any way, shape, or form. We are so proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Let's welcome Government Whip. Here.
Hold on, let me organize my papers. Before that, am I audible and clearly visible?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, he, him pronouns. I prefer POIs in the chat. I'll begin my speech in. Okay, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe in conservative countries, the first step towards acceptance is to find a middle ground and live together harmoniously. This debate can be divided into two things. First of all, which side has more effective actions? And second of all, which side brings more effective change? So on the theme of effects of actions, first of all, opposition takes extreme measures to maximize awareness, whereas on our side, we advocate for slow-going diplomatic actions to increase awareness. So first of all, they say that pride parades are there to maximize awareness. But panel, we believe that the goal is acceptance, not awareness. What's the use of awareness if conservatives target you? Awareness without acceptance just puts a target on your back. For LGBTQ plus individuals who are extremely vulnerable in these conservative countries, this is extremely dangerous for them because they are susceptible to violence, targeting, discrimination, and all those things that will happen in conservative countries. And these things happen in conservative countries because in liberal countries, we don't see this happening now because it is already accepted. They have freedom. No, thank you. And I prefer POS in the chat. But in conservative countries, this will continue to happen and discrimination will happen because the majority have their beliefs and values that go against these things. Second of all, they say pride parades are peaceful and that are peaceful. But we concede that pride parades are peaceful, but the implications are nothing but peaceful and cause chaos. even though people expressing themselves is good, and we still have that on our side, if it harms them and damages the LGBTQ plus movement, we will not stand with it because we believe it does more harm than good. Second of all, pride parades gives the conservatives a reason to actively go against the LGBTQ plus movement, because when there is a mass demonstration of a certain minority group protesting in the middle of the streets or going around in a parade, no matter what the parade is, it sends a signal to conservatives to actively attack the LGBTQ plus movement. One more thing they talked about under this theme is international support and help. But again, liberal countries, people in liberal countries already live in a liberal world with their own freedom. And it is very unlikely that they will, and very implausible that they will give support to these to the people in LGBTQ plus people in conservative countries. Because first of all, conservative countries actively try and hide the LGBTQ plus people and issues in their countries. So they will not know this in liberal countries. And second of all, LGBTQ plus people in liberal countries cannot voice out their complaints for fear of being jailed and targeted by the conservatives in the conservative countries. On side proposition, we have the common ground here is for acceptance, and we maintain this acceptance and increase it on our side. And on our side, we do it better because first of all, reasons why we do it better. First of all, conservatives again have very little exposure. For example, for a country like me in Malaysia, if there was a pride movement in my country, it would end terribly. The government would actively find these individuals in the country. There would be jailings and violence would even occur. Maybe not from the government, but amongst the conservatives in my country who believe that LGBTQ plus movements are not justified. Second of all, we maintain the image of the LGBTQ plus movement on our side because we do not inspire backlash, because we uphold that these LGBTQ plus people are the same people as these conservatives, and that they also are living in the society and want to work together with these conservatives. Again, the goal here is acceptance, not to encourage violence and backlash. And third of all, we have less backlash on side. On side opposition, backlash on their side will inspire fear for the LGBTQ plus members. And when this happens, it will reset the LGBTQ plus movement progress, because not only will they be less likely to come out and less likely to take actions that will further increase acceptance, because they have been lashed out against by the conservatives. Therefore, they have been targeted and they will not want to reveal themselves more. On our side, we believe that the potential harms that side opposition will cause, which is backlash and everything, will completely reset the LGBTQ plus movement in conservative countries, and we will not stand with it. And finally, panel, we believe actions that inspire violence and backlash are not morally justified. If there are more peaceful methods like on our side, they should always be prioritized because the benefits and goods far outweigh the harms. Even though we concede that these benefits will happen in the long term, on-site opposition, the short-term benefits will last very short, and backlash will result in severe problems between harmony of LGBTQ plus people and conservatives in their side. And second of all, there will be a potential to reduce support for LGBTQ plus movements on their side. And third, backlash through violence and condemnation is enough for us to win these teams of effects, because we will not contend with violence and condemnation of members of society. And we believe it is very important to ensure safety when taking actions. You wouldn't want to put yourself in danger and embarrassment to carry out your goals, even if they are justified or aligned with your values. We believe there is a certain time and place to take that in. And doing that now in the current state of conservative countries is a very destructive action. Moving on to my second theme, which is which side brings more effective change. First of all, side opposition says that there will be no more people coming out and that it will shut down legislation. But again, we aim for acceptance. OP has not proven why on their side backlash won't shut down all progress. We have proven to you that backlash will happen and that because of the views of conservatives don't align with these LGBTQ+ movements. And when this backlash happens, it will be extremely dangerous. And second of all, legislation will still happen on our side as acceptance increases. It just takes a considerable longer time, but it's worth noting that it will happen in the end. And we would advocate for this on our side. Moving on to they also say that rebut our education mechanism, that education model doesn't stand because on our side violence happens, because on their side violence happens once or twice a year, but on our side education causes violence year round. But two reasons why these are not true. First of all, in order to keep up why the education mechanism will happen. First of all, in order to keep up with the rest of the world, government has to accept the education mechanism. And second of all, and more crucially, even if they don't, education and exposure will still happen through media and will increase exposure amongst conservatives. Because if media outlets and social media shares these issues, conservatives will in the end see these issues, and as time progresses, they will accept it. And finally, common ground on this theme is that both sides want effective change and meaningful progress for the LGBTQ plus ideologies. But our side does it better because we lead to long-term change, which is more plausible and which uphold with current trends. Second of all, acceptance will slowly increase and inevitably increase, and legislation will inevitably happen as well. And third of all, the credibility and image of the LGBTQ plus movement is maintained. So this is why for these two themes, why we have won for the theme on bringing effective change and why our actions are more peaceful and more justified, which is why I believe we will win this debate. I am so proud to propose.
I thank the government whip for that fine speech. Let's welcome opposition whip. Here.
All right, cool. Can I check if I'm visible and audible?
Yes, clear.
Yeah, thanks. One sec. All right. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Basically, what proposition guarantees us at the end of this debate is that they have no change on their side of the house. Because of all the logic and characterization that they gave us, they basically guarantee that education cannot happen in the long run because locals will be mad. Then, as opposition, we guarantee one thing. Because of the time urgency, we want to break through the glass ceiling. Sure, it might mean that someone might be injured. It might mean that there might be war. But in the long run, we believe that the identity is more important than the physical body. We told you this from Elo, it was unresponded to. 3 questions. First of all, about international support. Second, about local support and hate. Lastly, about inclusion. First, international support. Notice that proposition basically concedes that the international community will care to some extent because all of their rebuttals are like basically concede that and say that like, hey, but the country won't let them in. Here's why. The UN will intervene and the country will be forced to let them in. First of all, in many instances, we told you that when LGBTQ communities have parades, and if that turns into, for example, violent crises, that means it turns into a humanitarian crisis. This means it is easier for a multilateral response from global hegemonies. This looks like the UN or America and Britain and Japan and huge hegemonies around the world collaborating together to try and get into this country to save all the people that are suffering, right? This can be also taken in the form of economic sanctions. For example, those on Afghanistan, which tell Afghanistan that if this doesn't happen, you're going to get sanctioned. We believe that this is going to work in the long run and also in terms of political pressure. But note that they have an incentive to do this, like huge hegemonies have an incentive to do this because they will get internal support from the people within their countries because of sensational media that show what's happening in conservative countries with the LGBTQ group. But even if you don't buy that countries will intervene in the conservative country on our side, we think that pride parades will still embolden internal support and covert organizations. And this is the nuance that we think proposition misses, because covert organizations still exist to different extents on the side of opposition in conservative countries. This looks like the hidden charity that is in the corner of the block that gives free food to the LGBTQ. These charities are going to be emboldened and we'll get more supporters, we'll get more donations, especially from developed countries. If developed countries and if social media, especially social media, sensationalizes the pride parades that are happening in conservative countries, this is a classical underdog story happening in a developing country. We think this will get a lot of attention, a lot of donations, which means that there is an ability for organizations and charities to work in these conservative countries. But Judge, why should you care about this? We think this should be weighed over the possibility of hatred from locals, because at most, they prove to us that some people might be jailed, but they don't even give us any mechanism for why jailing will be so rampant. We think emboldening charities is the biggest and most tangible issue of this debate, because we are able to guarantee LGBTQ individuals food. We're able to guarantee them better healthcare, because we're giving better charities and better organizations the power to do this. This means in the short run, we're empowering so many different individuals to survive another year. That's in and of itself should take off the debate, because there's no engagement from proposition. Onto the second clash then, about local support and hate, right? This is where basically proposition bases their entire case. They give us three premises. First, that pride parades will anger locals. Second, that locals and the government will react negatively, and therefore you will capture and kill the LGBTQ. We gave you two main responses here. The first was that the average and conservative man will probably not take arms against like a pride parade, right? Because this pride parade does not interfere in his own life. I have a job to do, right? I have kids that I need to care with, right? Like, I don't understand why proposition wants to characterize the average conservative man as so malicious that they're going to target pride parade, right? He doesn't want to interfere in his own life. But secondly, like, he doesn't want to risk his own life. He knows that if he starts shooting people, or if he starts injuring people in the pride parade, that his own life might be at danger. We don't understand any mechanism as to why they're going to interfere in the pride parade. So most of prop right now is an assertion. The second thing they tell us, and they assert this, is that the government will clamp down on pride parades. Here's why they won't and are unlikely to. The first is that like pride parades don't have any violence at all, but the moment when you're jailing these people is when obviously you're going to inspire confusion in your own country and also in the international community. Like literally, these are people who are waving rainbows out on the streets, and now you're going to go and send police to gas them. We, the average person living in the conservative country, like we told you from first, will get confused from this, and this means that they have like some degree of conscience. The moment when you see your government gassing people on these streets that are just there for fun is when you might think that, yeah, you know, LGBTQ people might have a reason, right? This is when it's likelier on the side of opposition to flip the conscience of the average man. This means, one, the governments will lose trust because now they are seen as the bad actors. No government wants the incentive to do, has an incentive to do this. But secondly, we told you that there's international interference. It's not like the international community will watch you commit a genocide on the people that are inside your country. We think this is very unreasonable. Therefore, just on this clash, we prove to you that the average man won't interfere, the government won't interfere. It's likely that these people are going to get what they want, right? But what is the prop comparative? And I think this is where it all goes to hell, because proposition tells us that they're guaranteed to not have change anyways, but using their own logic, we don't understand why education systems work. Therefore, we think the LGBTQ community is probably forced to forever stay hidden. We told you why top officials in authoritarian regimes or in dictatorships are unlikely to want to incorporate this in their education. They have no incentive to, and most of their government is probably religious. Here's how you weigh this though. The reason why you should weigh us, even with the possibility of someone getting injured over proposition, is because there is a time urgency to this, and this is irreversible. The moment when you choose to not interfere, or the moment when you choose to discourage everybody from going to a pride parade, is when you're wasting seconds. It's when you're hiding the identities of every single person. We think that identity is worth much more than a life. That's when you're literally wasting lives on the side of proposition. What is the last clash? The last clash is about inclusion, and we think we clearly take this. The way up here is this: which excludes people more? Literally discouraging them from a parade, or the possible negative reaction from some outsider group. We promised these individuals in LGBTQ communities a hiding space and like a space to be very comfortable and strong and resilient. We promised them a community, but on the side of proposition, they don't promise them anything. They tell them to not go to parades because you might get dangered. They tell them to stay in that closet forever and not tell people that you're in the LGBTQ community. We think at the end of the day, we're the only team who guarantees individuals to realize their individual freedom and therefore unlock the shackles that bound them to this very identity in developing worlds we're proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition whip for that fine speech. Let's start with the reply speeches. Op reply here.
Hi, am I both visible and audible?
Yes, clear.
Okay, cool. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. At the end of the debate, Prop has still left us unclear as to what their comparative is. In their prime minister, their counterfactual was education. Our question was, how does the government that is traditionally religious, conservative as they characterize, fund and subsidize those who they specifically campaigned against as evil? Prop has no comparative in this debate because this already loses them the debate. We were even charitable to assume that education maybe does exist, but that still doesn't do anything because people in the society, students, are societally conditioned to believe LGBTQ people are not should not be included. So therefore, I think that generally, because of the fact that they don't have a comparative to have in the debate, they have no suggestion of how they actually want to solve the issue of this. And the deputy came up and said, okay, well, because LGBTQ people have powerful people in the government. Like, that's not the truth, right? Like, because the fact that LGBTQ people are characterized as evil, like the government is obviously not going to let these people in the government. And the whip says, okay, there's media, right? It's an authoritarian conservative government. Media is probably controlled by the government. Media is probably most likely conservative as well because the rest of society is. So therefore, media probably is not going to spread liberal or like liberal media that's going to convince the general public to go against the general norm. I think that's generally just no comparative on their side. But here's what was completely unresponded on their case, because we said that there was absolutely no response to our second argument about inclusion. We explicitly told you that the second argument was a path to victory because we want people to live free from the twisted nature of societal norms, right? This is a principal right to identity that cannot be ignored because these people deserve a right and deserve their own definition of a good life. If you're going through the excruciating torture of societal norms every day, there's no point in the comparison of lives. But secondly, we told you there's going to be fractures because when people want to protest against the government, but the media and the message sent by the community is that you shouldn't and you should suppress yourself, there's going to be fractures in the movement. So furthermore, we're unclear as to how you're going to even get a community on their side. The only claim from Prop was that there will be violence because the movement is chaos. First, we already characterized you, right? The movement is not chaos. Traditionally, pride parades are peaceful. And secondly, we told you that we take them at the best. It's still beneficial because we told you there's going to be UN intervention. DPN said UN intervention doesn't exist because other countries are liberal. Like, that's not a claim to say why the UN won't intervene. We told you that to the point where where the issue becomes a humanitarian issue, where people have the active incentive, the UN has a literal humanitarian council to care about this, they probably are going to intervene. But thirdly, there's a cohesiveness to the fact that there's a common enemy to combat against. But thirdly, this is absolutely uncomparative because we suggest that violence still exists on their side, right? People still die on their side, and people die for no reason because they're still suppressing their own emotions and identities on their side. But lastly, play this, right? Even if it might be some injuries, as we suggested in WHIP, there's at least a counter narrative, right? At least people know that it is okay to resist the government. It's okay for themselves to come out of the closet that was utterly unresponded to. Therefore, I think that simply we win on both two arguments stand in this debate. We get far more international aid because the UN can intervene, and there's charities that are hidden or explicit that can donate. There's UN that has active incentive to do so because of an underdog story. We also proved the second claim that we're actually principally able to protect the people's individual rights, which is the incentive of the LGBTQ community coming from the first speech we gave. So for these reasons, I think that we're simply able to fulfill the incentives of the LGBTQ community. We're extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition reply for that fine speech. Let's welcome government's reply.
Just give me a minute to sort out my papers. Just to check, am I audible and visible?
Yes, clear.
All right. All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition today is essentially throwing everything that the LGBT movement wants to fight for in their faces without letting the conservatives actually understanding the suffering that they go through and the reasons they want to fight for this. In this debate, there are two things I'm going to talk about in my reply. First of all, the support for LGBT movement. Second of all, on the benefits towards those communities. So first of all, on the support, we believe that conservative countries will not, and people, LGBT people who live in these kind of countries, they will not get the aid that are needed for a couple of reasons. First of all, because conservative countries will actively try to hide the implicit injustice being done to these kind of people on a daily basis. Secondly, because we believe that liberal countries will very rarely step in, like they want to talk about the UN, they will very rarely step in unless there is an implicit injustice that is very clear that can be seen occurring. And as per their own characterization, they said that conservatives will not go in with guns blazing all the time when they see these kind of pride parades. But in those cases where they don't, it means that the implicit injustice that is harming them on a daily basis, the discrimination that these kind of individuals face, the discrimination that they can't even go into work with in fear of getting laughed at and discriminated against. This is the real harm being done towards LGBTQ communities, and that is something that opposition cannot solve because they just ignite. They are just adding fuel to the fire by creating these kind of pride parades, right? But thirdly, we believe that conservative countries, they have a religious and conservative reasons that those kind of humanitarian aid, people that are offering humanitarian aid, those people cannot fight against these kind of reasons because they see violence, right? And then we believe this is why LGBTQ communities that are Islam in Malaysia have to face death sentence, but no one has stepped in yet because of these kind of reasons. And then the contradiction on their side is that they tell you that liberal communities can give you these kind of aids because they see these kind of injustice occurring on media, but yet they say that our education mechanism does not work because people cannot access this kind of information through the media. We don't really understand why that's the case on their side of the house, and therefore we believe that we take this. But second of all, towards the benefits towards these kind of individuals in LGBT communities, right? On their side, they are by creating these kind of pride parades, while we concede that some of the time, it's quite peaceful and like they don't actually create this kind of violence, but in many cases they do. But even in rare cases where they don't, we believe that they are creating a very divided opinion between two sides. Some people will fully support these kind of pride parades, and some people will not. And therefore, this creates a very divided opinion. And at the end of the day, the majority of the people in the country will not support this kind of thing because they are conservatives, right? We also believe that conservative governments will use the violence and chaos caused by pride parades to fight and just justify their lack of freedom, right? There's no response from them on the violence and chaos. But lastly, we have already told you that our education and connections mechanism works because of the public image that these kind of countries need to maintain. Because without these kind of pride parades, these countries, they do not have an excuse to not accept these kind of communities. They don't have an excuse to not progress. But with the violence and chaos that these kind of pride parades cause, they can just use that to their advantage. So what is the best case on their side of the house? On their side, perhaps the LGBT community will be united momentarily, that they believe that they can cause change and believe that they can show their own identity to the world right now in those kind of pride parades. But we believe at the end of the day, the government is the one controlling these kind of situations. When when conservatives and the majority of the higher class do not agree with these kind of values, that is when they still cannot prosper. That is when majority of people will still have to hide their identity. But what's our worst case of our side of the house, right? Sure, some people are forced to hide themselves for a longer time. They cannot fully demonstrate their identity on the streets. But at least we are creating slow-paced change. When we tell you that education is something that it's not like in characteristical, but it can change the mindset of people in the future generation. When we tell you that these people, they can eventually get the justice that can be served, this is something that people want to fight for. We believe only on our side we can achieve acceptance for everyone. For all these reasons, very proud of you.